The first warning wasn't sight. It was sound. A thin, metallic whine cut through the haze, high, unnatural, and growing louder. Then came the impact. A single flash on the horizon. A wall of water rising where no shell should have reached. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the lookout whispered, "That's impossible." February 17th, 1944. Truk Lagoon, Japan's island fortress in the Pacific. For years, it had been untouchable. But today, it was burning. Columns of smoke curled thousands of feet into a sky turned black. Amid the chaos, 4 Japanese warships fled north, engines straining, hoping distance would save them. They never realized that distance no longer mattered. 30 miles to the south, beyond the horizon, a pair of American giants cut through the surf USS Iowa and USS New Jersey. They didn't chase with eyes. They hunted with numbers. Inside Iowa's plotting room, radar pings echoed like a heartbeat. Range to target, 32,000 yards. Too far for optics, too far for hope, but not too far for mathematics. The captain gave the order. 9 guns turned as one. Shells, each weighing nearly a ton, slid into place. Powder, breech, lock. Fire 1. The sound was not thunder. It was something deeper. The air itself split open. The ship recoiled, and 3 shells climbed into the clouds, vanishing from sight. 45 seconds later, the ocean far beyond the horizon erupted in flame. A cruiser vanished. No one on the Japanese bridge even saw where death had come from. It was the longest-range surface strike in naval history. But this was more than a record. It was a revelation. Because while Japan believed victory came from courage and skill, America had built something else. A machine that could think. And on that morning at Truk, for the first time in history, calculation defeated faith. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it understood the rhythm of naval war. It was a rhythm born not of machines, but of men. Precision through discipline. Victory through proximity. Since the triumph at Tsushima in 1905, when Japan's fleet annihilated the Russians in a storm of gunfire, the nation's admirals had built their entire doctrine on one principle: the decisive battle, the Kantai-Kessen. In that imagined clash, 2 great fleets would close the distance, line up broadside to broadside, and fight until one was broken. It was a philosophy that elevated courage above calculation and faith above technology. By 1944, that faith had hardened into culture. Every officer, every midshipman, had been trained to believe that range was not just a number, it was a measure of honor. Battles were meant to be fought where the human eye could still see the enemy, where a commander's instinct and a gun crew's discipline decided the outcome. Close enough for rangefinders to glint in the sunlight, close enough to smell cordite and burning oil. The Japanese called it the fighting spirit. It wasn't arrogance. It was tradition. Generations of sailors had grown up worshiping the idea that bravery could bridge any gap. And for a time, that belief worked. Japanese gunnery was precise, almost artistic. Optical rangefinders made in Yokosuka and Kure were among the finest in the world. Massive telescopic arrays capable of calculating distance by splitting an image into 2 halves and aligning them by hand. In perfect weather, at moderate range, they were astonishingly accurate. But they relied on a world that no longer existed. War in the Pacific was a storm of smoke, rain, and distance. Visibility changed by the minute. Horizons vanished behind squalls. A battle could turn on a cloud bank or a gust of wind, and no matter how sharp the human eye, it could not pierce fog or curvature. To the men of the combined fleet, that limitation didn't seem fatal. Their ships, Yamato, Musashi, Kongo, were armed with the largest guns ever built. 18-inch monsters that could, on paper, throw shells farther than anything afloat. But on paper is where their advantage ended. Beyond 15 miles, optical fire control became guesswork. Even the mighty Yamato's shells, heavier and faster, scattered harmlessly once the target slipped beneath the horizon. Still, the Japanese command clung to their doctrine. They believed that when the decisive day came, Their superior training would offset whatever the Americans had in industry or machines. The plan was simple. Draw the U.S. fleet into home waters, ambush it near the islands, close the range, and finish the fight with courage and steel. What they didn't realize was that the war they'd prepared for, the war of eyes and hearts, had already ended. While Japan worshipped precision through optics, America was teaching its ships to see with radio waves. While Japanese officers drilled crews to measure angles by hand, American technicians were building machines that could compute solutions faster than any human brain. In Tokyo, a few engineers warned of this gap. They'd seen radar demonstrated, read reports of Allied experiments, and urged the Navy to integrate the new technology into its fire control systems. But their pleas were drowned out by older voices, men who had spent their careers proving that bravery and training were enough. To admit otherwise would have meant admitting that the entire doctrine of Kantai Kessen was obsolete. So, as 1944 dawned, the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed confidently into a world it no longer understood. Its gunners still practiced with range drums and slide rules. Its officers still quoted Tsushima as prophecy. And its admirals still believed that if they could just close the range, if they could see the enemy with their own eyes, they could win. They didn't yet know that they would never get the chance. Because in that same year, across the ocean, American battleships were being fitted with something no Japanese officer had ever faced: radar that could see through storms, and a mechanical brain that could turn that vision into precise, lethal mathematics. At Truk Lagoon, those two worlds were about to meet, and one of them would vanish in smoke. By 1944, the United States Navy was fighting a different kind of war, one waged not by instinct, but by equations. Where the Japanese trusted the human eye, the Americans trusted a pulse of electricity and a set of spinning gears. The secret lay in two inventions, one electronic, one mechanical, that together turned steel into precision. The first was the Mark 8 fire control radar. The second, the Rangekeeper analog computer. To understand why they changed everything, imagine standing on the deck of a ship rolling through 10-foot waves. Your target is a blur on the horizon, moving 20 miles an hour, 15 miles away. Your guns fire shells that take nearly a minute to reach their mark, and in that minute, the target will have shifted hundreds of yards. Now add wind, humidity, temperature, and the rotation of the Earth. Every variable must be guessed, calculated, and corrected in real time. Miss once, and the enemy adjusts. Miss twice, and he hits back. For decades, naval gunnery depended on human judgment and geometry. On Japanese ships, officers hunched over range tables and shouted numbers through voice tubes. On American ships, that math had been given to a machine. Inside every battleship sat a silent, humming mind of brass and steel, the Mark 1A Rangekeeper. It was not a computer in the modern sense, but a mechanical brain made of gears and cams, each linked to a sensor somewhere on the ship. Radar or optical data fed in from the directors above deck. The Rangekeeper took that raw information: target bearing, range, speed, and began to solve an equation of death. It accounted for the ship's own movement, pitch, roll, wind, muzzle velocity, even the wear of the gun barrels after repeated firing. All of it updated continuously, dozens of times per second. The result wasn't guesswork. It was prediction. The Rangekeeper told gunners not where the target was, but where it would be when the shell arrived. It transformed gunnery from art into science, from reaction into anticipation. Above deck, the Mark 8 radar completed the transformation. It sent invisible radio pulses across miles of open sea, bouncing off enemy hulls hidden by fog or darkness. The returning echoes glowed on a green screen, showing exactly how far the target was and how fast it was moving. Before radar, night battles were chaos, ships firing blind, guessing at shadows. With radar, darkness no longer mattered. The enemy was visible even through storms and smoke. Together, radar and Rangekeeper gave the U.S. Navy something no other fleet on Earth possessed: the ability to fight and win at ranges beyond human comprehension. For every shell fired, the Mark 8 and Rangekeeper performed a symphony of calculation. Gears spun. Data flowed. Bearings adjusted. When the command came, fire, the guns did not simply shoot. They executed an algorithm, each turret elevated to a precise angle, corrected for wind, temperature, and curvature of the Earth. The entire ship became one vast machine designed for a single purpose, to ensure that mathematics could kill. The Japanese had radar too, but it was primitive, good for detection, not for fire control. It could tell them an enemy existed, but not exactly where, and not how fast. Their data had to be written down, calculated manually, then relayed by voice to the guns. Every step took time. Every second widened the gap. By the time Japanese crews fired their first ranging shots, the Americans had already hit. It wasn't that the Japanese lacked skill. They were expert gunners, disciplined and courageous. But they were fighting a new kind of enemy, one guided not by eyesight or instinct, but by computation. On the deck of the Iowa, the system's hum was constant, mechanical, almost alive. The radar traced. The rangekeeper calculated. The men trusted. One sailor later said, "It felt like the ship itself was thinking," and in a sense, it was. The Iowa was a living equation, and its answer was destruction. This was the hidden revolution of the war, a shift from intuition to automation. It did not roar like engines or flash like guns, but it changed everything. It made courage irrelevant. It made distance meaningless. When the Iowa opened fire at Truk Lagoon, those shells were more than weapons. They were proof that war had entered the age of information. And that day, Japan's faith in the human spirit met its first true rival. A machine that could see farther, think faster, and never miss. February 1944. The Pacific War had entered its most brutal phase. The United States was no longer fighting for survival. It was advancing, island by island, toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. And at the center of Japan's defensive web lay a lagoon that had once seemed untouchable. They called it Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific. A vast natural harbor ringed by coral reefs, deep enough to shelter hundreds of ships, hidden behind a fortress of anti-aircraft guns and fighter bases. For 2 years, it had been the forward anchor of Japan's combined fleet. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, every major operation in the Central Pacific had passed through this lagoon. American sailors spoke of it in whispers. Truk was where the enemy hid his claws. But by February 1944, the tides had turned. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands had fallen. American carriers now roamed freely across the Central Pacific, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, decided it was time to strike directly at the heart of Japan's naval power. The plan was called Operation Hailstone, a 2-day assault by 9 aircraft carriers, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. It would become one of the most devastating raids of the entire war. Before dawn on February 17th, the first American strike groups took off. Fighter pilots climbed into a pale blue sky streaked with clouds. Below them stretched Truk Lagoon, an expanse of turquoise water dotted with ships, airfields, and warehouses. At 8:30 a.m., the first bombs fell. By noon, the lagoon was an inferno. Explosions rolled across the anchorage. Ammunition depots detonated in blinding fireballs. Japanese aircraft, still on the ground, were ripped apart by strafing runs. The sea turned black with burning oil. Pilots, returning to their carriers, could see the smoke from 100 miles away. In just a few hours, American planes had destroyed more than 250 Japanese aircraft and dozens of ships. Truk, the fortress that had once terrified the Pacific, was collapsing. But amid the chaos, several warships managed to escape. A light cruiser, Katori, 2 destroyers, and an auxiliary cruiser slipped through the northern passes under cover of smoke. They fled north, hoping to reach Saipan in safety. Reports reached Admiral Spruance aboard his flagship, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis. Most commanders would have let them go. After all, the sky was already filled with American aircraft. The fleeing ships were wounded, burning, and running for their lives. But Spruance was not content with destruction from above. He wanted to prove that the surface fleet, the battleships, still mattered. For years, aircraft had stolen the battleship's glory. The great guns that once ruled the seas now mostly guarded carriers or shelled beaches. But Spruant saw an opportunity, a chance to remind the world that the big guns could still hunt and kill. He issued an order that surprised even his staff. Form a surface task group. Intercept the fleeing Japanese ships. Engage them in open combat. The order raced through the fleet. 2 battleships, Iowa and New Jersey. 2 heavy cruisers, Minneapolis and New Orleans. 4 destroyers as screen. 1 light carrier, Cowpens, for reconnaissance. Together, they became Task Group 50.9 Spruant's Hunters. At 11 a.m., Iowa's engines roared to full power. The ship surged ahead, cutting through the Pacific at 33 knots, the fastest any battleship had ever gone in combat. Spruant himself transferred aboard New Jersey to command the chase. By early afternoon, American reconnaissance planes spotted the Japanese convoy about 30 miles northwest of Truk, moving north at full speed. The weather was hazy, visibility poor, but the radar screens aboard Iowa and New Jersey showed everything clearly. 4 distinct contacts, spread out in a desperate flight. Spruant gave the order, intercept and destroy. The men on Iowa's bridge could not yet see their prey, but the radar operators called out the ranges with mechanical calm. 32,000 yards, 30,000, 28. In the plotting room below, the rangekeeper came alive, feeding data from radar and gyro compasses into its spinning network of gears. The ship's gunnery officers adjusted elevation and bearing. Every few seconds, the computers updated the solution. The Japanese ships had no idea they were already being targeted. They still relied on their optical rangefinders, scanning empty fog. To them, the horizon looked calm. Spruant's surface force closed in like a phantom. The American ships were still hull down, hidden by the curvature of the earth when Iowa's turrets began to turn. At 1:20 p.m., the order came down. All batteries, prepare for surface action. Below decks, gun crews loaded high-capacity shells, each nearly 2,000 pounds of steel and explosive, designed to tear through light armor and fragment on impact. Each shell had its own trajectory calculated, each angle confirmed. At 1:36 p.m., Iowa opened fire. 3 guns roared, the sound rolling across the ocean like an earthquake. 45 seconds later, waterspouts erupted around Katori. The first salvo fell short, the second overshot. The third straddled the target. The Japanese cruiser began to weave, laying smoke, firing its smaller guns in defiance. But there was no escape. The American shells followed in tight patterns. Each correction fed instantly into the rangekeeper. The 4th salvo hit home. 1 shell smashed through Katori's bridge. Another detonated amidships. Flames tore through her decks. Her escorts tried to cover her with smoke and launched torpedoes that ran harmlessly wide. Within minutes, Katori was dead in the water. Her crew fought on, firing even as the ship listed. Then a final salvo struck her magazine. A plume of fire erupted, and the cruiser vanished beneath the waves. The destroyer Mikazuki tried to turn back, drawing fire away from her dying flagship. She fired her torpedoes, but they missed wide. The heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans joined in, their 8-inch guns pounding her until she split in half. The last destroyer, Milwaukee, escaped into the rain squalls too fast to catch, too far to hit. But the point had been made. In less than 90 minutes, 3 Japanese ships had been annihilated. The Americans suffered no casualties, no damage, not even a near miss. For the first time in history, a battleship had destroyed an enemy it could not see with its own eyes. The range over 20 miles was the longest confirmed surface engagement ever recorded. The guns of the Iowa had spoken, and the age of mechanical precision had announced itself to the world. The battle was over, but its meaning was only beginning to unfold, because behind the spectacle of fire and steel lay something deeper, a transformation that Japan's admirals could never have foreseen. War had entered the realm of the invisible. From this day on, Victory would belong not to those who saw first, but to those who could calculate faster. By the evening of February 17th, the waters around Truk Lagoon were silent again. Where hundreds of ships had once floated in tight formation, only twisted masts and burning oil marked the surface. The smell of cordite and fuel hung heavy in the air. The Gibraltar of the Pacific had ceased to exist. That night, Admiral Spruance's task group rejoined the main fleet. The men aboard Iowa and New Jersey were exhausted, ears still ringing from hours of gunfire. They knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, a battle fought almost entirely by instruments. No one on their decks had ever seen the enemy. Only the radar had seen. Only the computers had known where to aim. For the Japanese, it was a disaster beyond comprehension. In just 48 hours, Operation Hailstone had destroyed more than 250 aircraft, sunk over 40 ships, and crippled Truk's capacity as a naval base. The lagoon that had once served as Japan's principal anchorage in the Central Pacific was now a graveyard. Survivors clung to debris, drifting through water coated with burning oil. Rescue ships were forbidden from entering. The risk of explosion was too high. News of the devastation reached Tokyo days later, filtered through fragments of radio reports and the few sailors who managed to reach nearby islands. The Japanese command initially refused to believe it. They had always imagined that Truk would be impregnable. Its guns, its airfields, its ships, it was supposed to be untouchable. But the photographs taken by American reconnaissance aircraft left no doubt. The fortress had been erased. The shock ran deep. Japanese officers had known for months that America's industrial power was overwhelming, that her carriers could strike anywhere. But this was different. Truk had not fallen to bombers alone. It had been finished by battleships firing beyond sight by weapons that rendered traditional doctrine meaningless. In naval academies across Japan, the idea of the decisive battle, the Kantai-Kessen, had been sacred. Generations of officers had believed that courage and training could close the technological gap. Now, for the first time, that belief was shattered. If a ship could be destroyed by an enemy it could not even see, then the principles that had guided Japan's navy for 40 years were worthless. Reports from Truk detailed what little could be salvaged. Thousands of men were dead. The base's fuel reserves were gone. Repair docks were destroyed. Supply lines across the Central Pacific had been cut. The remaining warships, crippled and scattered, limped back to Japan, unable to rejoin the fight. In Washington, analysts studied the after-action reports with quiet amazement. The data confirmed what they had only theorized before. Radar-directed fire control had made range and even visibility irrelevant. For the first time, a fleet could operate and strike entirely in the dark, guided only by mathematics and radio waves. The age of optical warfare was over. For Admiral Spruance, the lesson was clear. He had proven that the surface fleet still had purpose not as relics, but as instruments of precision. Yet he also knew what few were willing to admit. This kind of victory marked the end of an era, not its rebirth. The guns had done their work flawlessly, but it was the carriers and the aircraft that had paved the way. The future no longer belonged to ships that could hit from 20 miles away. It belonged to machines that could strike from 200. In Tokyo, the surviving officers from Milwaukee and other vessels brought home a grim message. They described shells falling from nowhere, radar-guided strikes that hit faster than they could react, and the eerie precision of the American gunnery. To the Imperial General Staff, it sounded like science fiction. But those who had seen it firsthand understood the truth. Japan had entered a war it could no longer win. One Japanese officer, years later, recalled the moment he heard of Truk's destruction. "We knew then that courage was no longer enough. The Americans had learned to see without eyes." In the aftermath, the U.S. Navy counted its losses. 21 aircraft, fewer than 100 men. For Japan, the losses were beyond calculation. Truk had been more than a base, it had been a symbol of power, a reminder that Japan still ruled the Pacific. Now it was gone, erased in 2 days by a combination of air power, radar, and relentless precision. Beneath the surface, hundreds of wrecks came to rest on the sandy floor, ships, planes, submarines, all trapped in silence. Today, divers call it the Ghost Fleet of Truk Lagoon. The coral has reclaimed it, but the scars remain. Operation Hailstone was not a decisive battle. It was an execution. A single, clean demonstration that technology, not numbers, not bravery, would decide the fate of empires. From that moment on, Japan's naval strategy was broken. The age of the battleship was ending, and a new kind of warfare, one built on electronics, speed, and calculation, was taking its place. Truk Lagoon, once the pride of an empire, had become its tomb. The destruction of Truk Lagoon marked a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in the history of naval warfare itself. It was no longer a contest of battleships meeting on the horizon, exchanging broadsides until one slipped beneath the waves. From that day forward, the sea belonged to those who could see without seeing, who could strike without being struck. For Japan, the psychological shock was immense. Its admirals had believed for years that they could force the United States into one decisive fleet engagement near their home islands, a modern replay of Tsushima, where skill and courage would defeat superior numbers. But Operation Hailstone showed that the Americans no longer fought by those rules. The war of maneuvers and gunnery duels had been replaced by a war of detection, coordination, and data. When word reached the combined fleet headquarters in Tokyo, the mood turned from disbelief to despair. The fleet had been hollowed out long before the loss of carriers at Midway, the grinding attrition in the Solomons, the constant bleeding of merchant ships to American submarines. But Truk was supposed to remain inviolable. Its fall proved that nowhere was safe, not even the heart of Japan's empire. In the months that followed, the combined fleet ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The surviving ships withdrew to Singapore and Japan, conserving what little fuel remained. Most would never sail into battle again. By the time American forces landed in the Marianas that summer, the Japanese Navy could do little more than watch from a distance. Operation Hailstone had erased Japan's last illusion of parity, and yet, for the Americans, it was something more than just another victory. It was confirmation that technology had permanently changed the nature of war. The reports from Iowa and New Jersey were studied line by line in Washington. The performance of the Mark 8 radar and the Rangekeeper computer exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Shells fired at targets 20 miles away had struck within yards of their predicted impact points. The calculations were exact, the timing flawless. It was as if the ships themselves had developed consciousness, a machine's version of intuition. In a sense, they had. Each crewman on those battleships had become part of a living system, an extension of radar, circuitry, and analog logic. The machine gave them eyes that could pierce storms and distance. The men gave it purpose. Together they formed something new, an intelligence made of steel, electricity, and flesh. The Japanese could not match it. Even after they recovered fragments of radar from downed American planes and captured equipment, they lacked the industrial base to reproduce it at scale. Their fire control systems remained mechanical and manual, bound by the limits of human reflex and eyesight. And as the Americans moved from island to island, the distance between the two navies grew not in miles, but in years. One Japanese officer, writing after the war, summarized the change with brutal honesty. The enemy fought with mathematics. We fought with courage. One was infinite, the other exhaustible. The sinking of Katori and her escorts had little immediate effect on the outcome of the war. Japan was already doomed, but symbolically, it mattered deeply. For the first time in history, battleships had proven capable of precision fire at a range once thought impossible, and they had done so through pure computation. It was the final vindication of the engineers who had built those systems, and the quiet death of everything the battleship once represented. Ironically, the success of Iowa and New Jersey only hastened their obsolescence. They had demonstrated that their guns could hit anything within 20 miles, yet the war no longer required them to. The aircraft carrier, with its 100-mile reach, had already taken the crown. By the end of 1944, the battleships that had once ruled the seas had been reduced to escorts, floating gun platforms protecting the true weapons of the modern era, planes. Still, for the men who served on them, Truk was proof that their ships mattered. For 90 minutes, the great guns of the Iowa and New Jersey had reminded the world what they could do. They had not fired blindly or in rage. They had fired with purpose, guided by invisible eyes and mechanical thought. And in that precision, there was something almost divine, a moment when human ambition and machine intelligence became one. When the battle report reached Washington, a single line from Captain McCrea's log stood out. It read simply, "Targets engaged beyond horizon. Fire control flawless. Recommend continued development of radar-directed gunnery." Bureaucratic words, cold and technical, but beneath them lay the birth of a new age. For centuries, the ocean had been ruled by the limits of sight. At Truk Lagoon, those limits disappeared. What began as a raid became a revelation. That the true power of war no longer lay in the size of a gun or the strength of a crew, but in the ability to process information faster than the enemy could react. The Japanese admirals never understood that until it was too late. By the time they realized what had happened at Truk, the world had already moved on. The age of battleships had ended, and a new one, cold, calculated, and ruled by machines, had begun. In the months after Truk, the Pacific seemed to tilt entirely toward the Americans. The momentum that had begun at Midway and accelerated through the Marshalls now became unstoppable. Japan still had ships, still had planes, still had men willing to die, but it no longer had time. The lesson of Truk spread quietly through every Navy wardroom in the world. Admirals who had once believed in armor and caliber began speaking instead about radar, computation, and speed. For the first time in centuries, the essence of naval power was shifting away from the ship itself and toward the systems that guided it. The Iowa class symbolized that shift. They were masterpieces of engineering, fast, elegant, and terrifying. Yet even as they fired their guns in triumph, they were already relics. Each shell they launched was a monument to a past that was ending. The Japanese never fully recovered from Truk. The surviving vessels retreated to home waters, conserving fuel that was already too scarce to waste. In March, the Americans struck the Palau Islands. By June, they were assaulting the Marianas. Saipan fell, then Guam, then Tinian. From those islands, American B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo itself. The Empire's defensive line had been torn apart. By late 1944, the Imperial Navy made one last effort to restore its honor. At Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, Japan threw in everything it had: battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers. Among them was the Yamato, the largest warship ever built, mounting 9 18-inch guns, bigger than anything the Americans possessed. It was supposed to be the embodiment of Japanese power, the ultimate expression of Kantai-Kessen, but the doctrine that had created her was already dead. At Leyte, aircraft, not battleships, decided the outcome. Planes from American carriers swarmed the Japanese fleet, striking from beyond the horizon, just as the Iowa had done at Truk, but now the range was not 20 miles, it was 200. The Yamato and her sister ships never even saw most of the planes that killed them. When the battle was over, the Japanese fleet was finished as a coherent force. A few months later, in April 1945, Yamato herself was sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa. Her guns, built to duel other battleships, never fired at a single one. Hundreds of American aircraft sank her within 2 hours. Her destruction was complete, physical, symbolic, inevitable. The Iowa-class ships, meanwhile, continued to serve. They shelled island fortifications, escorted carrier groups, and fired their massive guns in support of invasions. But their role had changed. They were no longer the heart of the fleet, they were its shield. The new center of power rode on flat decks above them, engines humming, propellers spinning, aircraft rising into the dawn. After Japan's surrender in 1945, the Iowa and her sisters returned home as survivors of a vanished world. They were the last of the great battleships, fast enough to keep up with carriers, strong enough to inspire awe, and obsolete the moment they were launched. Their creators had built them to fight other giants. Instead, they spent their lives fighting shadows and memories. Yet the story of Truk gave them something that no aircraft carrier could claim. For 90 minutes, in February 1944, the Iowa class proved the full potential of the battleship, the fusion of human discipline and mechanical intellect. It was a brief, perfect moment when every promise of naval warfare since the age of sail came true, and it ended as quickly as it began. In the decades that followed, the battleships lingered, modernized, reactivated, refitted. They bombarded Korea in the 1,950 seconds, Vietnam in the 1,960 seconds, and even Iraq in 1991. Their guns thundered across generations, echoing from a past that refused to die. But each time they fired, the world around them had changed a little more. Satellites, missiles, computers, each new invention pushed them further toward irrelevance. By the end of the century, all 4 Iowa-class ships had become museums. Visitors walked their decks, stood inside their turrets, and touched the cold steel that had once shaped history. Children peered into the barrels of the great 16-inch guns, unaware that those same barrels had once hurled fire across 20 miles of ocean. The ghosts of Truk still rest beneath the Pacific, coral growing over their bones. The men who fought there are gone, their stories fading into the sound of waves. But the lesson of that day endures. Truk Lagoon was not just a battle, it was a revelation. It marked the exact moment when war crossed the line between human perception and machine logic, between courage and computation. From that point onward, every conflict would follow the same pattern. The side that could see, think, and act faster would win. In the cold mathematics of the Iowa's guns lay the future of every war to come. And as those shells rose into the clouds above Truk, tracing invisible arcs toward targets beyond the horizon, the modern age of warfare truly began. In the decades that followed the war, the legend of Truk Lagoon grew larger than the battle itself. Divers who descended into its still waters found an underwater graveyard, hundreds of ships, planes, and lives frozen in time. The coral had softened their outlines, turning weapons of war into monuments of silence. Sunlight filtered through the wreckage, illuminating shells still in their racks, gas masks lying beside rusted rifles, plates scattered across mess tables that would never again serve a meal. The Pacific had reclaimed its dead. For historians, Truk became a paradox. It was not a grand clash between fleets, nor a decisive moment in the sense of Midway or Leyte, yet it revealed more about the future of warfare than any battle before it. Truk showed that technology could not only magnify human strength, it could replace it. Courage and discipline still mattered, but they no longer decided outcomes on their own. From that point onward, the power that truly mattered was the power to process information. What radar and analog computation began in 1944 would soon evolve into the digital age. Within a decade, vacuum tubes became transistors, gears became circuits, and the principles that guided the Iowa's rangekeeper laid the groundwork for the computers that now dominate every battlefield. The same logic that calculated trajectories across the Pacific would one day guide missiles through space, predict storms, and send data across continents. The mechanical brain that aimed the Iowa's guns was the ancestor of every modern system that sees, decides, and kills in milliseconds. For the men who served on those ships, the memory of Truk never faded. They spoke of the sound, the deep, concussive roar of the 16-inch guns, the tremor that ran through the entire hull, the long, eerie silence while the shells traveled miles through the sky. Then, 45 seconds later, the distant bloom of fire on the horizon. To them, it had felt less like shooting at an enemy and more like commanding the elements themselves. Power beyond comprehension. When the war ended, some of those same men visited the wrecks at Truk decades later. They swam through the sunken ships, through twisted ladders and shattered bridges, and watched schools of fish drift where men once fought and died. For a moment, the ghosts of 1,944 seemed to stir in the light, and the veterans realized what they had truly witnessed: not just a battle, but a transformation. They had seen the end of one age and the birth of another. An age where machines would think faster than their makers, where precision would replace passion, and where the boundaries of distance and visibility would cease to exist. Truk Lagoon had been the rehearsal for the modern world. Even today, the coordinates of that battle remain etched in the annals of naval history: 7 degrees, 22 minutes north, 151 degrees, 55 minutes east, a patch of sea where time seemed to split in two. Before Truk, war was fought by sight and courage. After Truk, it was fought by data. The Iowa herself would go on to serve for half a century through Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. Her guns would fire again, but never with the same meaning. Each salvo in later wars was a salute to history, an echo of that February morning when she reached across 20 miles of ocean and touched the future. When she was finally retired, the Iowa was preserved as a museum, moored quietly in Los Angeles. Visitors who walk her decks today can stand beneath the great turrets and look out toward the horizon. If they close their eyes, they can almost hear the hum of the radar, the low thrum of the rainkeeper, and the thunder that once shook the Pacific. They are standing on the last ship that proved the battleship's power and the first that proved its irrelevance. The Japanese admirals who had once believed in courage over calculation never recovered from that lesson. After the war, many wrote memoirs reflecting on their defeat. One of them, a former staff officer of the combined fleet, ended his book with a single line that captured the tragedy of an empire built on faith. "We trained our men to fight like heroes, but they died against machines that had no fear." That was the truth of Truk Lagoon. It was not just the end of a battle, it was the end of an idea that human will alone could master the chaos of war. At Truk, the machines had answered otherwise, and as the sun sets over the wrecks today, the coral glows faintly beneath the waves, wrapping the ruins in quiet light. Somewhere below, beneath layers of sand and memory, lies the shattered hull of the cruiser Katori. Her guns still point toward the horizon, frozen in defiance against an enemy that no longer needed to see her to strike. The lagoon is silent now, but if you listen closely, past the whisper of water and the hum of the tides, you can almost hear it, the echo of distant thunder, rolling endlessly through time, the last breath of an empire, and the first sound of the modern world. Today, the silence of Truk Lagoon tells a story louder than any cannon ever could. It is a story of progress and extinction of human ambition, building machines so perfect that they made their creators obsolete. When divers glide through the wreckage, their flashlights sweep across the relics of two worlds, one that believed in valor and one that believed in precision. Steel skeletons of ships that once carried the pride of empires now lie motionless, their guns aimed forever at nothing. The sea has forgiven them. Fish dart through corridors that once echoed with alarms. Coral blossoms from twisted decks where sailors once fought for their lives. Each rusted hull is both a tomb and a teacher. A reminder that technology, once unleashed, never stops changing what it means to be powerful. For the United States, Truk marked a kind of awakening. The Navy that emerged from those waters was not the same one that had entered the war in 1941. It was faster, colder, infinitely more analytical. By war's end, American ships were equipped with fire control systems more advanced than anything imagined just 5 years earlier. Computers no longer just calculated trajectories, they coordinated entire fleets. The path from the Iowa's rangekeeper led directly to the digital command centers that now dominate every ocean. The Japanese Navy, by contrast, never recovered. Its remnants spent the rest of the war hiding among islands or guarding convoys that would never arrive. Its carriers were destroyed, its airmen spent, its battleships sunk or rusting in harbor. And yet, for all the tragedy, there was dignity in their end. They had fought for an idea that courage could overcome machines, and in dying, they proved how completely that idea had passed into history. In the decades after the war, the wrecks at Truk became pilgrimage sites. Former enemies dove side by side, Americans and Japanese alike, exploring the rusted remains of a world that no longer existed. They spoke quietly beneath the waves, gestures and bubbles their only language, bound by a shared understanding that history had swallowed them both. Some of the artifacts raised from the lagoon are displayed in museums now: compasses, shells, even fragments of rangefinders. They are beautiful in their simplicity, relics of an age when human hands still turned the wheels of war. But what they represent is far more complex. The moment when humanity's reach outpaced its grasp. The technology that ended Truk did not stop with radar and gears. In the years that followed, guided missiles replaced shells, satellites replaced scouts, and digital computers replaced the analog minds that had once whispered solutions in the Iowa's plotting rooms. War had become invisible, instantaneous, and absolute. Truk was only the beginning, and yet there is something haunting in that beginning, because in its thunder and fire there was still the trace of humanity, a ship full of men trusting machines they did not understand, fighting enemies they could not see, believing in a cause greater than themselves. Theirs was not a mechanical war, not yet. It was still fought by people, with fear and sweat and trembling hands. The machines only made them faster, not yet replaceable. Perhaps that is why Truk endures in memory. It was the last moment when courage and technology stood side by side before one consumed the other. The Iowa's gunners, the Japanese sailors of the Katori, the pilots who fought above the burning lagoon, all of them were caught in the same transformation. They lived at the edge of an age and became its witnesses. Today, as the ocean closes over the wrecks and time erases the scars, the echoes of that transformation still reach us. In every radar pulse, every missile launch, every algorithm that now decides life and death, there is a trace of the Iowa's first impossible shot across 20 miles of sea. The same principle, the same cold perfection of numbers still rules the battlefield. But beneath that perfection lies the same truth that Truk revealed. Technology may decide the outcome, but it is humanity that bears the cost. The men of Truk, American and Japanese, never lived to see the future their battle created. Yet, in a way, they shaped it more profoundly than anyone else. Their courage built the machines that would make courage irrelevant. Their skill perfected the systems that would make skill unnecessary. Their sacrifice turned the page from the age of heroes to the age of algorithms. And somewhere, beneath the quiet waters of the Pacific, their story still unfolds, one rusted rivet, one coral-covered hull at a time. The lagoon keeps its secrets well, but if you listen long enough, through the weight of 60 feet of water and 80 years of silence, you can still hear it. The distant echo of a gun that fired beyond the horizon. The sound that ended one world and began the next.